I was telling Habib that this is very much like my term paper for your seminar. I am not being facetious. When he called me to ask me to come, I had an idea on the heritage thing, but I had no paper. And then a few weeks ago, he was asking me for the title, and I said, I still have no paper exactly yet. And I began to have to write very quickly. I'm sure this is an experience that you've had. And so I apologize. I hope you will not mark me down for being 1 week late turning in my paper, but it's the best I could do. So one thing we know about heritage things is that they are not for sale, at least not rhetorically. Even when a value is put on them, they are still said to be priceless. Private ownership of heritage things is always problematical. They are subject to a certain morality that proclaims they should not be hidden, at least not hidden away forever. When Carl Sandburg met Marilyn Monroe, he remarked, she was not the usual movie idol. There was something democratic about her. I am about to argue that it's not just Marilyn. We can say of all our heritage things, there is something democratic and attractive about them. Heritage things are symbolic touchstones, things we choose not to throw away, that we tell stories about, stories that we share that can be appreciated from a number of different angles. At any given moment, we will find Native Americans, European Americans, and Native Europeans visiting the First Peoples Hall at the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. What are they doing there? I will try to explain. What they have come to see are things that they cannot have. Heritage things are market resistant. Stradivarius violins and paintings by old masters are bought and sold, but when they are, it makes the news, and often there is controversy. Nobel Prize medals and Hollywood Oscars are not for sale until they happen to come up for sale. And when they do, the purchase does not necessarily follow the contours of ordinary transactions. James D. Watson sold the Nobel medal he received for decoding DNA for $4.76 million American dollars. The buyer gifted the medal back to Watson, and Watson gave the money he received for it to charity. I'm sure that some of you know the backstory on that one. Some makers of ne plus ultra commodities understand the essential structure of the heritage thing and identify their products with it. The slogan of Patek Philippe watches is, you never actually own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation. When Fiat bought controlling interest in Ferrari, their researchers discovered the global market for the supercar was substantially larger than its production output. They ordered Ferrari CEO Luca Cordero to increase production and profits up to market capacity. Cordero refused, saying in effect, if everyone who wants a Ferrari and who could afford one was able to purchase one, Ferrari would cease to be Ferrari. Ferrari, I love this. Ferrari is a universal heritage brand and not just another consumer product, because Cordero and his predecessors, back to Il Commendatore himself, understood that desire must be kept separate from possession, that the appeal of Ferrari is vastly larger than its circle of ownership, that everyone is equal in their unrealized desires. I don't know whether you know the story, a bunch of octogenarian Ferrari machinists and metal beaters, when they discovered that yuppies in Silicon Valley were buying old Ferraris for $3 and $4 million a whack, decided what the hell, we'll just get back together in one of our garages. We know how to do that. And they built a few copies and sold them off not as copies. And now, and they had a better retirement as a result of that. Now the copies are selling for more than the originals. Heritage things, historical, cultural, and natural, are the main power source at the interior of tourism's vast global economy. Angkor Wat, Notre Dame Cathedral, the Matterhorn, the Grand Canyon, the Great Wall of China, the Pyramid at Cheops, the unique triangular Cape of Good Hope first issue postage stamp in the Smithsonian Institution, all stand outside the marketplace. They resolutely resist private possession. Heritage things appear on everyone's bucket list, the things one waits for a lifetime to see. Some cities and regions, London, Paris, Washington, D.C., Greece, have dense accumulation of heritage things to the point where the entire locality has a touristic aura. It is no longer just a city or a region. It becomes a beloved destination, a magnet for almost universal desire. Many heritage things can be visited and viewed free of charge. There is no charge for tourists to visit the White House in Washington, D.C., and most U.S. national monuments. Without paying, I can walk down Grant Avenue through Chinatown in San Francisco or across the Golden Gate Bridge. In the 1960s, the Louvre allowed free admission to one of its galleries on Friday nights. I met poor students, I don't know if that's still a policy, but I met poor students who made it their practice of hitchhiking halfway across France to take advantage of the Friday night single gallery free admission, and who eventually were able to see the entire museum that way. Admission fees to heritage attractions, considered in aggregate, constitute a minuscule part of the tourist economy. The money that changes hands is for transportation, meals, lodging, travel clothes, sunscreen, motion sickness pills, guides, smartphone roaming fees, house and dog sitters, travel insurance, photographic equipment and processing. Very little for the attraction itself. But if we take the heritage things out of the equation, all of the above ancillary transactions would dwindle to nothing. The tourist comes home with a souvenir purchase, a brochure, a postcard, some used ticket stubs, and photos for their family album are posted to their Facebook page. Some tourists return with absolutely nothing but their memories and a suitcase filled with dirty laundry. Let's be frank. Tourists spend trillions and get nothing materially tangible or useful in return. From a purely economic standpoint, nothing could be more irrational than heritage tourism. Yet it is precisely this irrationality that fuels the world's largest industry. And I love this paradox. This sympathetic magic assures powerful subjective identification with heritage things. Being in its presence imparts some of the symbolic values it embodies to the visitor. Heritage icons circulate as talisman. No wonder Big Capital eventually erected its own simulacra of heritage things, first at Disneyland, then at themed resorts everywhere else on Earth. Las Vegas has recomposed itself of large-scale copies: the canals of Venice, the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Pyramid at Luxor, King Tut's tomb, the Statue of Liberty, the Golden Gate Bridge, all perched conveniently in the Nevada desert. There's the Luxor under construction. Liberty, Grant's Tomb, Empire State Building, the Arc de Triomphe under construction, the Eiffel Tower under construction. They actually have two Golden Gate Bridges. The tourist consumers travel to the product rather than vice versa. They spend enormous sums of money, but they don't take the product home. They leave it behind for the next consumer. It is impossible to conceive of a superior business model. But it is ultimately dependent on the economic irrationality of tourist desire that originated in the tug of heritage things on the psyche of the tourist. Neither heritage things, apparently even fake heritage things, nor tourist experience of them are commodities in any conventional economic sense of the term. They have only subjective value that motivate a desire to visit them. So our task is to discover the ways heritage things tug on tourist subjectivity without losing sight of the cultural context in which this is occurring or the depth and magnitude of their potential economic effects. There is something radically democratic about them. When the history of 20th century social science is written, a key chapter will describe the progress that was made in understanding the human subject or subjectivity. The progress appears as a kind of syncopation. Every new development in linguistics and semiotics was followed a half-beat later by a better mapping of the fissures, divisions, tensions, and accommodations interior to subjectivity. Freud carefully took apart earlier notions of subjective unity. The authenticity of being left over from quasi-religious 19th century social and humanistic theory. And he began to follow the movements of the divided self in civilized society. These range from schizofragmentation, so severe that the various parts of the psyche can barely comprehend or dialogue with one another, through normally neurotic shame, embarrassment, and guilt, to tragic and comic alienation, to prodigious feats of phenomenological and psychoanalytic introspection. We eventually got models for a subject or subjectivity that is analytically fit for the rigors of travel beyond the confines of its culture. Hiding in plain sight, tourism, sightseeing, travel, and heritage attractions are embedded in the DNA of modern social theory. Freud's dreams of travel figure prominently in the examples he assembled as he built his theories of the unconscious. In the interpretation of dreams, we find a plethora of observations along the following lines, not just about Rome, but also London, Paris, Istanbul, Athens. Freud wrote, "Thus the wish to go to Rome had become in my dream life a cloak and a symbol for a number of other passionate wishes." Anthropology and sociology also have privileged touristic moments in their indispensable texts. Recall the opening lines of Lévi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques. "Travel and travelers are two things I loathe, and yet here I am set to tell the tale of my expeditions." The way that Lévi-Strauss gave us Tristes Tropiques as a traveler's tale is fully isomorphic with a marked feature of so many of the Native American myths that he would eventually analyze in his multi-volume masterwork. The hero of the myth arrives at a crucial cultural insight by traveling to distant exotic lands seeking a vision. Sociology has its own touristic moment buried in one of the most important texts, and I will get to that in a moment. The split subject on tour. A main finding of the most recent interrogation of subjectivity suggests that the superego is now divided against itself. These are some of Freud's writings from abroad back to his family at home. Lacan works this out in the course of rebuilding the logical relations among subjectivity, the pleasure principle, memory, and language. He concludes, Lacan quote here, "A couple of signifiers is all it takes. The structure engendered by memory can mask the structure of memory itself. Thus we create a fault line and an abyss. Alternatively, we fill in elsewhere something that also resembles a fault line and an abyss. And it is here that we can see the subject as such is born. A subject, moreover, whose emergence is unjustified by anything else." On a cultural plane, what sits across Lacan's fault line and abyss, what accomplishes the work of this filling in elsewhere, is precisely the heritage thing. Following the lead of Freud, Lévi-Strauss, and Lacan, I'm about to argue that the heritage things are our shared materialization of the structures engendered by memory that mask the structure of memory itself. The enormous global heritage project suggests that the status of memory, and especially the break between memory and memory's image and language, this break that according to Lacan is essential to the formation of the modern human subject, is also key to those parts of the new global economy that now depend upon tourism and harbinger of the next stage of the perfection of democracy. What happens if we treat a heritage thing as a social fact? Analysis of the object or the thing in the 20th century did not keep pace with analysis of the subject. Even Emil Durkheim, who was the most authoritative early advocate of empiricism and statistical measurement in sociology, based his rules of sociological method on his idea of the divided subject. He argued that interior to the psyche, with all its emotional ups and downs, fantasies and imagination that runs off in every direction, there is a core of social imperatives that do not originate in individual consciousness, practical and moral maxims, ways of acting, thinking, and feeling that originate external to the individual. The crucial part of subjectivity for Durkheim is the moral inhibitions and imperatives that shape collective social relations, relations that both predate and postdate the arrival of any given individual, what he calls, quote, the unique data of the sociologist. Moral and practical norms originate in society and get inside the heads of individuals where they shape both subjectivity and behavior, quite similar actually to Freud's first idea of the superego. On the basis of its externality to mind, Durkheim argues that social facts are things. His first rule of method is treat a social fact as a thing. And I'll quote from Durkheim in English, here it is in French. Psychological facts are naturally given as conscious states of the individual from whom they do not seem to be even separable. Social facts, on the contrary, qualify much more naturally and immediately as things. Law is embodied in codes. The currents of daily life are recorded in statistical figures and historical monuments. Fashions are preserved in costumes and taste in works of art. Now, what jumps out is the preponderance of cultural and heritage attractions that make it onto Durkheim's short list of social facts. Works of art, historical monuments, native or ethnic costumes, even his laws and codes that are more lax or simply different are now being considered as basic to tourist travel desires. Evidently, there is something about heritage things that is fundamental to the social, so fundamental that Durkheim did not even bother to mark their presence as such in his short list of social facts. Here's the point where Durkheimian sociology and Lacanian psychoanalysis meet and merge in the field of tourism studies. It is unquestionably true that Durkheim's original set of examples of social facts have been absorbed into the global system of tourist attractions. Heritage things figure in both subjective and social formation, not as decoration or as optional extras, leisure devices, but as crucially determinative, that is to say, as foundational as the original set of social facts. Durkheim avers that there may well be variability in the ways that individual minds grasp the social fact or a heritage thing, but that does not change the social as external and objective and not subject to modification by an individual act of will. You might not wish to wear a bathing suit at the beach, and in fact you might even go without a bathing suit, but that does not change the norm or cancel the opprobrium that your behavior elicits, unless of course the beach is clothing optional. According to Durkheim, the quality of the object or the thing that makes it an appropriate foundation for sociology is its endurance in the face of desire. The most important characteristic of a thing, this is Durkheim, is the impossibility of its modification by a simple effort of the will. Not that the thing is refractory to all modification, but a mere act of will is insufficient to produce a change in it. It requires a more or less strenuous effort due to the resistance which it offers, and moreover, this effort is not always successful. End of Durkheim quote. On first examination, the great heritage things appear to be almost perfectly Durkheimian things. The Liberty Bell, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Eiffel Tower, the Great Wall, the Matterhorn, the Mona Lisa, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hope Diamond, all appear to the tourist gaze as charged with affect and among the most constant and unchanging objects in tourist cosmologies. They seem to be Durkheimian things par excellence. But we should note that in and of themselves they are not unchanging, nor even especially resistant to change. Contra Durkheim, every tourist thing, and indeed things in general, do fade, erode, rust, rot, fall, and break, get crushed, and succumb to the ravages of time. Some, like Michelangelo's Pietà, or the ancient Afghan Buddhas, and just now the Assyrian artifacts in the museum at Mosul, have been subject to wanton destructive attacks. In the case of famous ruins, it is precisely the process of the cultural object being worn down by nature that is the source of their attraction, though the tourists may unconsciously hold to the belief that natural decay started and stopped just for them. Occasionally, it is precisely the destruction of an object that the tourist comes to see. European tourists now visit Detroit to see the wreckage of industrial civilization. I have a graduate student in Germany, Lena, who is doing her dissertation on Detroit and European tourism there. Lena Techmeyer. Durkheim told us that we should accord to social phenomena the dignity of a thing. He did not note that if anything seems to be unchanging, it is because there has been social intervention. Preservation societies, government departments, museums, experts, art, science, technology, physical labor, and copious amounts of funding are orchestrated in a global effort to halt the changes that would naturally afflict our heritage objects. Laws prohibiting the removal of stones from petrified forests and from the Great Pyramids are stealthily and strictly enforced. The Mona Lisa has received several costly facials. The Liberty Bell was removed from Independence Hall in Philadelphia at great cost because the footsteps of its visitors threatened to bring down its equally sacred 18th century building. Durkheim that's my niece. Durkheim was arguably the most sociological of the founders of sociology. Paradoxically, in his famous dictum, he failed to note the priority of the social. It is not that social facts are like things. Things are like things are like things only because of human intervention. I'm going to skip a section on authenticity. We think they're authentic. Ed Brunner has argued with me about that. I go into that, but I readily concede to Professor Brunner that a strong case can be made for his hip, reflexive tourists who are able to laugh about the staging of authenticity at Disneyland, Main Street, USA, the Matterhorn at Disneyland, the Rivers of the World ride. But when the price of a tourist experience accrues to private interests, that is to say, individual or corporate profits, the appeal is restricted to individualistic enjoyments and cut off from the social and the psychic, considered in their most fundamental manifestations. Actually, this is interesting. This Tory, when I visited this Tory that had been knocked down by a hurricane, I found that the workers there, using ancient tools, and they were trained intergenerationally to live at the site and to keep it in a state of repair, which was the same as when it was built, 400 years. In the end, Ed Brunner was not able to convince me that tourists in general are able to shrug off or laugh off the staging of authenticity, especially when it comes to the authenticity of human heritage. Our most precious deep heritage things continue to engender unalloyed tourist desire for something real and true at the interior of constructed representation. The widespread empirical existence of staged authenticity in tourist settings has been found in dozens, perhaps hundreds of studies, and has vocal demand for authentic experience and heroic efforts to meet that demand, especially at heritage and ecotourism sites. So that's not going to go away. What remains under-examined and under-theorized is the persistent touristic demand that there should be something more deeply meaningful about their contacts with the objects of their desire, even as they accept a certain degree of artifice. Why they are willing to spend such vast sums of money for nothing that is either useful or tangible, simply for the experience of being there. While there have been some sketchy attempts at conceptualizing existential authenticity, the discoverer of what it is about heritage things that incessantly calls forth subjective tourist demand and desire remains unknown. Democracy, authenticity, and the common good. Heritage attractions are social in origin, but why must they also be authentic? Do we project authenticity onto them because they symbolically reflect back to us the common good? Can democracy survive if the common good is found to be inauthentic? And my answer to those questions is yes. And following a revisionist reading of Rousseau, I will go a step further and suggest that democracy cannot survive unless the common good is shown to be inauthentic. Begin by asking, what is the good of heritage? Are heritage attractions a part of the common good? Everyone who grapples with the meaning of heritage does underscore its theme of universal or ultimate value. Diane Bartel points out that as a modern-day democratic tourist, it's not just my heritage. I'm supposed to embrace and celebrate the ultimate value of the heritage of others. We are the world. And it is true, I do. I am just as intrigued and awed by the lesson of Srivana-Belagola, there's some cheap commercialized non-heritage attractions. There is a difference. This is the statue of Baahubali, and Baahubali was the second son of a Jain prophet, a very wealthy man. Do you all know this story? This is not, who knows the story? Oh, good. I get to share some universal heritage stuff with you. Baahubali, second son of a very wealthy emperor of the whole region. The father left his kingdom to his two oldest sons, and Baahubali decided that his older brother really shouldn't have any of it. It should have all been left to him, and so he went to war with his older brother, and he conquered his older brother and drove him out of the kingdom. And then, at that moment, he felt such remorse and such horrendous guilt that he'd done this horrible thing, that he gave away everything, the kingdom, all of the houses, all of the farmers, all of the public buildings, all of his clothing, all of his servants, and he went and stood in the forest in penance until the jungle just grew up around him. And now he is, for this act of penance, a major Jain saint. Now, I find this as appealing and interesting a story as anything that might be told about, my heritage object. Doesn't have to belong to anyone. Rousseau revisited the general will versus the common good. And here I'm going to very specifically set the general will in opposition to the common good. Something that has been done before, but in a very recherché place. Jean-Jacques Rousseau gave us our most intriguing and enduring common heritage reconstructions in his passage about natural man and humankind in a state of nature. According to Rousseau, in the beginning, our ancestors were able to satisfy all of their needs easily from the abundance provided by nature. Because there was no want, there was no need for either conflict or cooperation. People managed perfectly well as semi-isolated individuals. Rousseau asked us to imagine a perpetual springtime on earth, in his words, an original condition so good that no one would voluntarily surrender their primitive freedom, so appropriate to their natural indolence. Rousseau's reconstruction of natural man had sufficient traction to become the blueprint for Club Med resorts, lifestyle movements that emphasize simplicity and naturalism, and upscale, woodsy, mossy, leafy suburban design practice everywhere in the modern world. But the various ways Rousseau's modeling of the primitive has played out historically does not get us any closer to understanding the persistent insistence on authenticity. All modern-day Rousseauistic forms of reconstructed heritage are patently and sometimes absurdly inauthentic. We are fortunate to have recourse to several masterful readings of Rousseau, from Durkheim to Derrida. And in this line, Juliette Flower MacCannell, my spouse, has given us a series of books and articles that provide a decisive reinterpretation of Rousseau's intent. Now, I was privileged to be the first pre-publication reader of Juliette's writings on Rousseau, and I will press my advantage here to be the first to apply them to tourism studies. Now, in the next section, for purposes of this lecture, I will widen the circle of intimacy and refer to Juliette as Juliette. When I publish, she will have to go back to being Flower MacCannell, But anyway. Juliet argues that Rousseau's passionate aim was to establish a firm philosophical foundation for new democratic forms of government. From our current vantage point, this might seem trivial, but it is not. And a second look at Rousseau's text suggests that most of the work of democracy remains unfinished. I should say, in fairness to her, that this is only probably a 10th or a 20th of Juliet's writing. So she's not totally a Rousseauiste, but she's a good Rousseauiste. In a democracy, according to Juliet's reading of Rousseau, the law can have no source other than the people it governs. It cannot be based on either religion or natural law. Rousseau told us, "I take men as they are and laws as they might be." Proof of how radical this proposition continues to be can be found in the visible and vocal resistance to it from countless democratically elected office holders who pontificate that the origin of the law is in God and that they are really only God's representatives. I don't know whether you have this problem in Canada, but it infests the U.S. Politics. Rousseau was far from naive about the difficulty of establishing a true democracy, given that its greatest threats will always come from within. Juliet explains that every system of laws generates its own fundamental fantasy. And this is a crucial insight. The laws of civil society are designed primarily to protect property rights, to prevent the strong from simply appropriating the belongings of the weak by force or by threat of force. She lays out the logic that connects the laws of civil society to the fantasy of total enjoyment. If unrestrained by law, someone or some social group or faction, as they gain in strength and power, will eventually begin to take every good for themselves, and they will eventually end up with everything. This leads to a kind of paranoid, egoistic jealousy becoming the unspoken psychic bedrock of the law of civil society. On the basis of her deductions, Juliet revisited Rousseau's image of natural man as a primal fantasy of total enjoyment. Just, you get hungry, you pick a fruit. Rousseau's natural man presages every subsequent pleasure-monopolizing despot who seeks to take over everything. If turned loose in society today, Rousseau's natural man, satisfying himself completely at his whim, never concerning himself with the needs or the feelings of others, would be a true monster. As Durkheim reminds us, it is precisely this compelling fantasy, this sentimentalization of our egoistic origins, that must be brought into the light if civil society is ever to perfect itself. That is, if we are ever to achieve a true democracy. This bringing to light the troubling quality of our collective heritage fantasy was Rousseau's purpose in mobilizing the image. His intent was certainly not to advocate a return to a state of nature, as some have suggested. Reviewing Rousseau's passages on natural man and the state of nature, Durkheim immediately quotes Rousseau's own gloss on them, namely that they no longer exist, they never existed, and they never will exist. In other words, Rousseau gave it to us as a fiction of origins that is there to be analyzed for what it means for us today. All heritage workers seeking to inject authenticity into their displays should take note. Even demonstrably inauthentic reconstructions of human heritage are revelatory of our most fundamental fantasies and desires. This suggests that the main task of serious heritage workers would be to explicate heritage reconstructions for what they can reveal about the psyche today, the laws governing our coexistence, and the evolution of human desire, independent of questions of their authenticity. Why did Rousseau give us this image of our common heritage that is both repelling and appealing at the same time? It always comes back to his unwavering focus on inequality of wealth. Rousseau assumed that the rich will always be with us, that no amount of redistributive social engineering will ever make wealth inequality go away. In The Social Contract, he explains that ongoing redistribution of goods does nothing to alter the underlying inequality that makes redistribution possible, or the envy that it evokes. The only real question is, in a democracy, how do we live with enormous differences in wealth in such a way that it does no harm? This is no small task. If there is any truth in Rousseau's dictum, Rousseau said, the rich would cease to be happy if the poor would cease to be miserable. The good of the whole, the common good, is always and only invoked to oppress the weak by the strong. Juliet was the first to point out that Rousseau put forth an alternative principle for democratic law, a principle that is not based on the common good. She explains, according to Rousseau, the good, any notion of the good of the whole, is a flawed ethical basis for democracy, because the good of the whole will always be expropriated by the narrow self-interests of a powerful subgroup, class, or party. If an ethics of democracy is based on the good of the whole, it will devolve into what is good for the ruling class. Justice will become, and this is a Rousseau quote, nothing but what is good for the wicked and evil to the just. If the basis of democratic law is the good, with this underlying fantasy of total enjoyment, it will hasten into being an apocalyptic democratic monstrosity in which everything of any value, material or symbolic, is in the hands of a very few, or as we say today, of the 1%. What Rousseau put in the place of the common good as the ethical foundation of the laws of a functional democracy is his intriguing and elusive idea of the general will. Rousseau's general will is what remains if all narrow self-interest can be neutralized, if all the pluses and minuses, the sum total of private wills, could be made to cancel each other out. Neutralized is the key term here. He is not asking us to give up our property or our private religious or other beliefs. Only that we not impose them on others against their will. A strong basis not for the good of the whole, but the general will is required if we are ever to achieve an authentic sovereignty of the people, actual separation of powers, and a true rule of law under conditions of extreme economic inequality. The market produces a situation where goods and money can be piled up, but is it possible to isolate the inequality produced by markets from all other human qualities? That is the question Rousseau asked and answered in the affirmative. Can we get to the point where we can say with conviction, it's only wealth? That's all it is. It counts for nothing else. Can we find our way to a historical place where no one person or faction can make the claim that they have the good of the whole on their side? This is the only development that can institute the democratic principle of equality before the law, a law that must be the law of the whole, not of just one privileged part. True freedom can never be based on privilege. It is not freedom to exercise my will, but freedom from being imposed upon by the will of others. Only a general will can ensure freedom from discriminatory application of the law based on personal properties, poverty, wealth, gender, skin color, or religious beliefs. A law that is not founded on something that might be hoarded up and eventually monopolized must be based on an absence or lack. This was Juliet's insight when she noted that what Rousseau put in the place of the good was the law of desire. One cannot desire what one possesses, only what one lacks. The general will is the remainder after everyone gives up imposing their individual wills on others. What remains to the body politic after this great abnegation is what Juliet calls a loss held in common. It's a very nice phrase, a loss held in common. A denial of that magnitude, passion flowing into a common desire, a gift of universal benevolence, is almost unimaginable. But Rousseau imagined it as the only possible basis for a law of the whole, that is to say, an authentically democratic law. Was there ever an expression of the general will except on paper in a few lines of constitutional law? If the general will today needs proof of its own existence, it need look no further than heritage tourism and the beliefs and desires surrounding the heritage thing. The democratization of tourist desire. Without the general will to counter economic inequality, the declaration that we are all equal before the law is hollow. But we are all equal before the heritage attraction. Any day of the year, weather permitting, I can position myself on or near the Golden Gate Bridge and observe every kind of human passing by. Males and females and transsexuals from every corner of the globe, homeless and billionaires, every age, every ethnicity, the so-called disabled, the content and the suicidal. Even the blind express enthusiasm for sightseeing at the bridge, which they experience as a unique combination of undulating movements, low-frequency vibrations, humming sounds, and the excited cries of other tourists in countless languages, and wind that comes from below. Democracy, a work in progress. If you go on the web, you can find, as of a week or so ago, 657,000 selfies taken by people with the Golden Gate Bridge as a background. And this is just a grab off of like the first 5 pages. The best definition of the heritage thing is that it represents a loss held in common. That is important beyond reckoning because no one person or party or class may claim it as their own. Now, wealthy elites have always coveted heritage things and sought to claim them. Bill Gates purchased Leonardo da Vinci's notebook, Codex Lycus, for $30 million. Steven Spielberg purchased the exclusive movie rights to Martin Luther King speeches. It's the reason why the Martin Luther King movie that just came out was so wooden. The movie maker couldn't actually quote Martin Luther King. So he's up there making bogus Martin Luther King speeches all the way through the movie. Because Spielberg owns that piece of our heritage. Casino moguls erect plausible copies of even large-scale heritage objects that everyone knows are fakes but enjoys anyway. Only recently are we seeing efforts to counterfeit not merely the heritage thing, but the general will itself. And I apologize for bringing in a Canadian example at this point, but the most recent example is Canadian. The effort to put up a monument to the victims of communism on the Parliament grounds in Ottawa. I suspect the proponents of the bogus memorial will find that the general will can neither be controlled nor counterfeited, I hope. It's a small world, after all. The forces at work here can be illustrated by the recent hullabaloo over a ride at Disneyland, and I went over this same ground in my recent book on the ethics of sightseeing, but it's worth reproducing here at the end. Disneyland began as a heavily hyped, commercialized attraction. It is ascending to take its place in the rank of World Heritage attractions. As it grows in symbolic significance, so does the tension between its origins as a tourist trap and new stature as an authentic tourist experience. The ride, It's a Small World, began life as an artificially constructed pastiche of representations of cultural difference. Groups of stereotypical puppet children from different lands sing to the tourists along the route of the ride. And they produced one of the worst earworms in the history of music. It's a small world after all. In 2008, the Walt Disney Company decided that they might boost the flagging sales of plush toys in the gift shops by adding Disney cartoon figures to the groups of ethnically diverse puppet children. As they began to revamp the ride, the internet exploded with angry responses, calling the revision a, quote, marketing ploy that defiles the original theme. The changes, these are quotes, the changes are a crass attempt by Disney to make the attraction more commercial and sell more plush toys. Another quote, I'll sign any petition, wear any t-shirt, or handcuff myself in a human chain to It's a Small World in protest. The family of the original designer sent a letter to Disney calling it a, quote, idiotic plan and a gross desecration. And they say also in the letter, they should leave the ride the way it was, with the children of the world, and leave all the Disney characters out. It just bastardizes the whole ride, end quote. When Disney Corp eventually yielded to the protests and withdrew their proposal, they admitted in effect that they no longer owned it to do with as they pleased. The general will spoke. It's a Small World is now a loss held in common. It is a heritage thing. Even its putative owner cannot impose its will. The owner must now share in the loss. And I'll stop there. This paper has been growing at both ends, so I can only give you but
thank you so much. Thank you again, Jim. On va discuter un peu en anglais, bien sûr, mais en français, si vous voulez, on va essayer de traduire. Yes.
Mr. MacCannell, I have a very silly question. What do you think is the recipe of turning a heritage thing into a tourist attraction, or whether the recipe differs from one society to another? Thank you.
I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to that question, because I think it works rather the other way around. That it's the movement of the tourist to the heritage thing that we need to explain. Not is there some kind of formula that a way we can embed a heritage thing in some kind of matrix that will turn it into an attraction, but it's basically the circulation of stories about this thing that causes people naturally to go to it. It's not necessarily advertising. In fact, advertising can actually work the other way around and turn people off. These things are aggressive and democratic, and they occur over time. It's the tourists that are making it into the attraction, not something that the curator does that makes it into the attraction. So you have to examine what kind of demand is being made on the desire of the tourist by that particular symbolic sort of arrangement that is represented by the object. And some of them are fairly easy to decode. I mean, the Grand Canyon, you know, what a testament to the persistence of a weak effort. There's a little stream running down the bottom, and oh my God, it made that. So there are some symbolic sort of elements that will almost automatically make people's hair stand on end, and they'll go and they'll want to see that thing. But others are more elusive, and like, you know, I have yet to understand. It's a small world, but it's happening. You know, it used to be a hyped up attraction, true. Now it's the tourists have appropriated it as a part of the general will. And it's that process of appropriation and the reasons behind that that we should be looking at. Not any, you know, is there a better way to display this object? Should we put in more electronic whiz-bang stuff to get the kids interested, etc.? All those things are perfectly fine to do, but I don't think they have anything to do with what's going on here.
My question for you would be, it's about the general will.
Yeah.
It's really linked, basically, this is a good example, it's a small world after all, and also the Bill Gates thing, or maybe what's happening downstairs too. I was wondering, because we say general will, but is it basically the will of the people that are affected by it? For example, the people that are not affected, like, in a big way of an event, like, they will not stand up for it, even if they might be a majority, like, since they're not affected a lot. But if it affects a minority that speaks a lot, the government or the institution will move in what they think is like the volumes coming from that group, and there's a silent majority there that they just either don't care or they don't, it doesn't affect them such in a way that they will go on strike or like take up arms to defend their points. So when is it general will versus which one has a bigger like voice?
Yeah. Well, I don't pretend to have worked out the politics of it, but in terms of your example, I would have to know what is the nature of the demand that's being made, no matter how it's mobilizing the people. What is the nature of the demand? In the United States, the religious right says that they demand the right to impose their religious beliefs on everyone else. That we believe we have the good, that we believe that abortions are bad, and you know, they can believe that as much as they wish. But the point at which they mobilize and say, we have religious freedom, we can impose our beliefs on everyone, that's the opposite of what it says originally, where the framers of the U.S. Constitution, of course, are reading Rousseau, reading these same passages, and saying, no, it's freedom from religion. And so if the mobilization is in that direction, if the people are saying, no, we're fighting for the right not to have your will imposed upon us, they're on the side of the general will. The other kind of mobilization is on the side of the general good, which they believe that they hold closely. And so you can't answer your question until you examine the nature of the demand. Once you've studied the demand, you're going to see pretty quickly which side it falls on, even if it's a fight in the same arena. Like, how do we arrange the relationship of religion and politics?
You should say that to the Rick Perry, governor of Texas.
Yeah, well,
he just said it's not the freedom from religion. It doesn't. Anyway,
no,
some laws are passed.
These issues, which I'm trying to discover the philosophical, the kind of the ultimate human basis for these issues, are now coming forward. And, you know, we may be on the brink of some kind of horrendous confrontation, but nothing less than the future of democracy is at stake. You know, if we accede to those that say one vote equals $1, the Supreme Court decision saying that, you know, people can spend unlimited amounts of money influencing elections, which now is the law in the United States, that was clearly a decision made on the side of the general good. We know these billionaires have your best interest at heart. Of course we do. They're rich, so they must have the general good on their side. Or will we be able to turn that around and say, no, no one has any more influence than anyone else, which would be the Rousseauistic position. He was much more realistic than Marx about the nature of the future of democracy. And we're actually, I think, just beginning to see the general will play itself out in real behaviors. But the reason why I'm standing here and blah, blah, blahing today is that I believe that given the paradox, the actual contradiction at the heart of global tourism, that is the world's biggest industry and has no economic basis whatsoever. It's only based on human desire, which does not have any possibility of economic reward, okay? So you get the biggest industry with no economics in it at its base. The fact that that is asserting itself in this way suggests to me that the general will is alive and well and and people are working it out in their actual choices and behaviors as tourists and heritage workers and tourism researchers, potentially. They become conscious of it. It's happening. It's not something that we're just sort of going to try to conjure up out of theory. So I am seeing tourism as potentially modeling a better future.
Simon?
Actually, I appreciate tourism because actually I work as a tourist guide in Quebec City, so I have direct access to or dealing with tourists when they arrive here. It also gives me access to, I have to learn about the history of the place and so on. So I'm thinking, you started the talk off by talking about objects or things with a monetary value, which makes them, therefore, in a sense, valued more. Then you talk about or a place which is immovable, and therefore has that desire to actually go visit it, and that's that desire that creates this flux. That's what humanity is about, to know about the story. What I'm concerned or interested in is, I mean, people do come and come to see the typical site. But what I also find is that people are also very interested when they start learning more about what is not interesting, about what is able to be alongside it. So the person that goes to visit the Taj Mahal, I've seen it, there's the selfie, now where's the next place, is leaving with a lot emptier experience than someone that maybe would speak with the groundskeeper or so on. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I'm also involved in heritage organizations and in heritage tourism, especially dealing with Anglophone heritage within Quebec, which is a very strange beast as well, partly because of the demographics in the regions which are disappearing. And so I'm dealing with a situation of how do we maintain or first of all, how do you at least record the information and the data of how life used to be, because it's not going to be like that anymore. And then how can you transmit that to either to people who are still living there or to people who would visit. And the idea is how to then create a sort of tourism that isn't based upon the $1 million Violet Stradivarius, but is more based upon the tombstone of the local baker. And in that sense, in fact, turn heritage, this sort of monumental heritage, completely around into the storytelling of time, place of the ordinary man. So that's what I'm concerned about. I'm wondering whether if you can see a market or a desire of people to go in that route as well.
Well, I think you're living proof of that as you speak. I'm not just being flip, actually. The desire to, quote unquote, get off the beaten track and to see things that other tourists have not seen is that's absolutely documented. You know, through the whole history of tourism research, we know that is a fundamental desire amongst virtually every tourist that would take a look at the Liberty Bell and then want to see something like the Revolutionary War period cemetery down the street. So we know that every tourist, and that's a part of this kind of motivation and desire. You don't know. They don't know. They want to be surprised. They want to know something new. That drive to know something new is there. I'm not talking about it here. I have talked about it elsewhere, especially in my book, The Ethics of Sightseeing, that's a fundamental ethical imperative of sightseeing. You have to go find that thing that is not known. And so what you're doing, you're sitting right there witnessing that turn. And you are also doing the only thing that can be done meaningfully in that moment is to tell the story, and even tell your story of how you discovered that, so that they have not just a new observation of a place, but they have a human connection, another human connection to that place. And what you're doing, the way you've described it so nicely, figures in little something that's going on at or near every heritage attraction on the face of the earth right now, as we speak. Now, of course, a pretty big group of them, the non-ethical ones, the ego trippers, I call them, get their selfies and move on. And if that were the only thing going on in tourism, I would have no hope for it. But that's not the only thing. You can do an ethical trip, and that's what you're witnessing.
So how do we develop that in people? How do we help build it? So because I'm just thinking about, you mentioned the Liberty Bell and how everyone goes to visit it and they've seen it. In a sense, it loses its authenticity.
No, it loses its meaning.
Yeah, okay. But it also, in a sense, also its authenticity of everything behind it, it just becomes an object. In the same way, a violin that's not played is an object,
right.
And it's not, ultimately a violin makes no noise at all unless somebody is playing.
No, that is absolutely the case. But that's not the Statue of Liberty's fault. That's not the Stradivarius's fault. They're still there. Every one of these objects, as a heritage thing, that's why I'm emphasizing the thingness of it, will live through that stupid kind of inauthentic appropriation of it, and be there for the next tourist to come along and go, okay, now I'm finding out something about myself and other people that I never knew before. And that's your task, is to keep that object alive in that way. And usually when I'm talking to people who have your kind of job, I tell them nothing is more effective in that than talking to them about your relationship to the object. Yes, tell them the history. Yes, tell them other famous people's observations. Whatever. But when you tell them about the first time you went there and what you thought, that's when they start to, that's when the general will begins to assert and affirm itself. I would say that authenticity is mainly a demand when everything is framed in terms of the good. Okay? So I'm trying to move a little bit past it. I'm recognizing that authenticity remains a very important part of the working definition of curators and others. I've never had any concern about that. Everybody wants to make sure that they haven't bought a fake painting. Everybody wants to make sure the restoration doesn't destroy the object. Mm-hmm. So that's just built into the whole tourist desire. And but the question is, some things actually move from being inauthentic, as in the case of Disneyland, to being authentic. It's a small world. It's actually made a transition, and that transition is based upon the way it's being appropriated by the tourists, moving away from it just being a commercialized attraction to being an expression of the general will. Okay. Now, inequality that you ask about is absolutely problematical in the context of democracy. It was Rousseau that linked those two, and I'm reaffirming his linkage and also reaffirming his solution to the problematics. How can you actually have a democracy under conditions of inequality? And Rousseau makes the claim that it's very difficult, but yes, you can, if in fact there is, the democracy is an expression of the general will. Now, if we look at our politics today, we see that the general will is being, every effort is being made by the 1% to thwart or to destroy any kind of general will. They're working day and night to get rid of any affirmation of the general will. And in the politics, and you know, every once in a while somebody feebly raises their hand and say, but, you know, aren't women free to choose their own health measures? Or do we have to listen to the Republicans about this? But the reason why I came here and took your time for a whole hour is because I see to tourism, I see heritage tourism without it being conscious of itself as such, as being a very powerful modeling and affirmation of exactly what Rousseau was calling the general will. And so it's not affirming itself in the politics. The politics has been sort of fundamentally disrupted. Democratic politics, fundamentally disrupted. If it's ever going to find its way back on its feet, I hope that it does. One way that it can, now it can do it directly, it can do it by going back to the Enlightenment and figuring out what Juliet figured out, exactly what is the philosophical and ethical basis of an authentic democracy. Or it can do it by looking at what the people are doing. And the people worldwide are engaging in massively economically important, is my measure of how, you know, that this thing is real, engaging in heritage tourism. And there's no basis for that, I would argue, other than the general will. You can't generate it with advertising. You can't generate it with light shows and water features. It is just, is coming from the will of the people. And you can help it along, but you can't make it happen. And one of the things that was most interesting to me when I was writing The Tourist is that the two states in the United States at that time, in the 1970s, that had the highest revenues from tourism were New Jersey and California. And they ranked dead last, 49th and 50th, in the amount of advertising for tourism that they spent. And that's when I made up my mind that I wasn't studying commercialized attractions. I was studying something human, something different from something that could be hyped up and advertised and decorated and brought into being that way. Now, I'm not denying the importance of that stuff. It's a big part of the world economy, but it's not the engine of it.
Laurier, dernière question.
Yeah, one last question, because it sort of sparked something about, got me thinking about UNESCO and, you know, the World Heritage List, right, and all of that. And I mean, where would you put that in your model? I mean, in terms, because there is sort of an advertising through the practice of listing.
Yeah.
And but these sites are, because I was looking at TripAdvisor not so long ago, and I think 7 of the 10 most visited sites in the world are World Heritage sites that are on the UNESCO list.
Bravo. Well, first of all, the UNESCO, the whole idea of a UNESCO World Heritage Site precisely fits the model. That they're not nationalistic, they're not patriotic. They're you're calling shared heritage. And he really means shared heritage. And I subscribe to that completely. Now, I'm not denying that these places are advertised. Of course they are. And of course they're listed. And of course they're a part of package tours and all of that. But the package tour and the advertising exist because of them. They don't exist because of the advertising. That's the difference. And, you know, at first Disneyland only existed because of the advertising. There was no other basis for going there. And so that's the difference. If the millions of dissertations that have been written about every one of these objects are based on the standing of that object in the general will. They're not based on the fact that some corporation had a bunch of people, smart people, sitting around a board. By the way, I have never once in my entire life, as a fairly visible tourism researcher, been asked to consult with a travel business of any sort. And so they know perfectly well that what I'm doing has nothing to do with what they're doing. And I knew from the start that this kind of, the Pier 39, the picture Juliet took of Pier 39, that's not the same as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We all know that. Maybe someday it will be, but I seriously doubt that one's going to make it. I really don't understand how It's a Small World is making it.
Thank you so much.